Hello, friends. Welcome to the Logistics of Logistics podcast. My name is Joe Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's topic is Beyond the Tracks, the next frontier of American rail with my friend Martin Lew. How's it going, Martin?
Excellent. Thanks for having me on the show, Joe.
I'm excited to talk to you about this topic. We do not talk enough about rail. It's out there and we all know a little bit about it, but hopefully Martin is going to educate us today so we'll know more about rail, because it is a great option that does not get used as much as it should. So Martin, please introduce yourself and your company and where you're calling from today.
Great. I'm Martin Lew, CEO and founder of Commtrex. I'm currently in Houston, Texas. This is where our home base is located. We've been in Houston, Texas since we started the company back in 2017.
Very nice. Very nice. So what does Commtrex do?
Commtrex is a platform that connects shippers. So that's beneficial cargo owners, any payers of freight, anybody who's moving any cargo or freight by rail, with rail service providers, class 1 railroads, short line railroads, terminals, warehouses, ports, lessors. So just think about the ecosystem of the supply demand of the rail ecosystem. The shippers are the demand side, and on the supply side, you have everybody who services the shippers. So the platform really provides a conduit or visibility for shippers to be able to find the providers they need to move freight by rail.
And you're also working with the logistics companies, right?
Absolutely. A lot of logistic providers use our platform to be able to identify the different transloaders, warehouses, ports, terminals, where they're moving their commodities or their containers to. We provide a direct connection to over 2,000 providers across US, Canada, and Mexico.
Yep. Just to simplify it before we hit record, I was saying, is this like Match.com for rail?
Yes, it's definitely not Tinder, because we're a little more visceral than Tinder. And it's definitely not eHarmony, because we're not trying to get folks married. The goal ultimately is to be able to make the match and effectively make sure that the folks that are moving freight can find the highest quality and the best partner to handle their move at either origin or destination.
Yeah. And I said this before we hit the record button, is I feel like we all know a little bit about rail, and we know of it, and we know it's a great fit in some cases, but not for everything. It's not the perfect solution for everyone, but for the right things, it is the perfect solution. And I know you're going to educate us a little bit about what can and should move on rail.
Yeah, that's correct. It's not obvious because we do get shippers of all sorts that I want to move product from Houston to Dallas, which is only less than 400-mile move. And rail economics don't hunt when you're talking under 500, 600 miles. Number one, and number two is volume. You need to be able to justify the volume to make the economics of the delivered cost hunt. And typically it's 4 trucks for every 1 rail carload. So typically you at least need 4 to 8 trucks of freight to move from origin to destination to make it actually work.
Yep. I like it. Martin, tell us a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? Some career highlights before you started the mothership that is Commtrex.
I grew up in Southern California. It's funny because there's not a huge sort of rail community or industry in Southern California outside of the Metro Rail, the surf liner that goes from San Diego to LA or Southern California. But I went to USC undergrad, went to law school at Boston College. I grew up in a very small business family. My grandparents started a business, call it 50, 60 years ago. So I grew up with a family full of entrepreneurs in Southern California. So I knew at heart at some point starting a business was in my future. And just watching my grandparents of that generation and how hard they worked and how much satisfaction they got out of having a business that was able to help the community. And then most importantly, they found a desire and passion for the business they started. So I grew up in an entrepreneurship family. And when I went to SC for undergrad, I was studying political science and communication. So law school was the path for me. And when I ended up I started actually my first startup company in undergrad. I started a company called Equate Systems. It was quite a bit ago. I raised some capital. I actually stopped school for about a year to run the venture, and then had to finish up some classes when the venture exited, and then went to law school at Boston College and went to law school to become a securities lawyer. And then halfway through law school, I decided that law school or being a lawyer long-term was not my desired passion. And I decided to let my parents know, my family know, that all these years of wanting to be a lawyer in a very traditional Asian family, lawyer, doctor, the 2 paths that you choose, and having to make that phone call to my parents and let them know that I got some good news and bad news. The good news is you got a lawyer in the family. The bad news is it's not me. The good news, it's going to be My wife. So the lady I found to marry is my wife is a lawyer.
See, you made that difficult call that you were no longer going to be their son.
Yeah. It was a very tough call. But with that being said, I did come from a family of entrepreneurs. They were very supportive of what I want to do. But the real goal at that time of getting out of law school was I needed to go find a job at a large company and really get some chops in the corporate world. So I ended up going to work for Bear Stearns. I applied for investment banking jobs and got a job here in Houston. Bear Stearns was starting an energy trading desk, and I got hired on to the coal and environmental markets trading desk as their first marketer originator. It was starting up in 2006, 2007. And I came from Southern California. It's not exactly Central Appalachia. Go to California where coal wasn't a thing. It was new to me, but I ended up growing into being a lead originator for the JP Morgan coal desk. So JP Morgan acquired Bear in March of 2008. The financial collapse happened, and luckily we were one of the two businesses that JP Morgan really wanted. They wanted the prime brokerage business and the global commodities business, and we were part of the investment banking, the global commodities business. And we were moving about, call it 5 million tons plus of coal per year throughout the US by rail, and then also moving it internationally to Asia and Europe. And that was my exposure to rail, is the fact that we're moving millions of tons of freight and cargo. And back then, and still today, coal historically has been the number one commodity by volume that moved on rail. By virtue of the fact that I was on the coal trading desk, I had a lot of exposure to it, but I really didn't have exposure to the logistics side of the business. My exposure was from the commercial side. And that's where the sort of light bulb moment came off, is why is it so difficult to be able to find rail-served transloaders, terminals and ports, to be able to find rail cars? There was no indices as well. There's no indexes for knowing how much the prices are for rail car storage, leasing, terminals. For the freight that moved on rail being commodities primarily, it's about 50%, 55% of all freight that moves on rail is commodities. I was surprised at how opaque the industry was. And so the light bulb moment for me was, at some point down the road, there has to be a digital platform that provides visibility and transparency to the North American rail network. And that's where the idea for Commtrex was born.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when I came to this, I came from automotive, and it was like 2010. And I remember just after the financial crisis, the Great Recession. And I remember thinking, I was at a 3PL thinking, wait, why do these companies come to us? They don't need us to tell them which trucking company to use. And the owner was like, yeah, they do. They don't know. They don't know how to do that. And I was like, it's just a phone call. We're making the same phone call. It's just an email, the same email, right? And the more I got into it, the more I realized it is a little more complex because you have to be able to pick the right partners. And a lot of companies don't know how to do it. And I thought, as soon as the internet grew up completely and you have some sort of matching system, that it would be easy. But what we start to realize is it's more than just a list. It's more than just, hey, here, Martin, here's a list. You should be all set. You go, I don't know who should I use, right? It's more complex. And by the way, when we look at over-the-road transportation, I was one of the people who believed that over time, because of technology, we would have less need for brokers. But as it turns out, the brokers and 3PLs were the ones who invested quite a bit in technology. And now brokered freight is a larger percentage of the overall. And I believe it's because they're adding value in the middle. And I remember everybody who's in this business had probably heard it, you're just a middleman. And I was like, I'm a middleman who brought you technology, made it more efficient, brought you headcount, and saved you money. So if you want to call me a middleman and all those things, I'm good with that. But is my grocery store where I go buy my milk, is that a middleman? Because I honestly don't want to drive to a dairy to get my own milk. They probably wouldn't sell me a carton.
That's a really good point, because when I did start the business in freight rail, and particularly on the commodity side or the carload side of the business, 3PLs and brokers aren't as large as you can on the intermodal side, where you have IMCs and 3PLs that are actually managing ocean freight and containers domestically and internationally. That concept really doesn't exist on the commodity side of the business. Even your largest 3PLs have a very small footprint within the commodity freight movement. And when I was actually surprised by that, because to your point, I just assumed that every transportation mode had these intermediaries that were providing all of the information, the connectivity, the pricing, really doing a lot of the legwork for the BCOs. And when I jumped into this and started this marketplace, my another light bulb moment was, wow, there really aren't a lot of intermediaries. So that sort of almost amplified the value of our platform, because there weren't these humans that could jump into the middle and be able to provide all this visibility to shippers and provide them with the information on who are the best partners or who are the folks that you shouldn't work with. We filled a much bigger hole than I initially assumed, because that component or those actors and this part of the freight industry didn't exist, and they still don't really exist today. Over time, the value of what we built, I was assuming that this would primarily be just for shippers and BCOs, but ultimately we see the largest 3PLs and IMCs and freight brokers using our system because they need the visibility as well. And for them, we provide that sort of similar tool that they almost provide to the other components of freight.
Yep. And it's a mode that we don't use nearly as much as we would use truckload or LTL or parcel. And I think a lot of times you have a guy who might be a truckload guy who says, oh, I understand LTL. We do some of that too. And we know parcel. We know how to make that happen. It's very seldom we hear somebody say, oh, we do a lot of rail. It's not the norm. And it is such a different business. And while we were prepping, I mentioned that I'd learned, I don't know, few years ago, somebody said the railroads, they build their own railroads, all the tracks, they're their own. So when we constantly are talking about we need to fix our infrastructure, railroad companies are constantly building their own tracks, and they're all over the world. They're all over the country, I should say, and doing a great job. And I keep thinking they've also, over time, it used to be if you lived near the railroad and it was loud and it rattled your house to the point your house would not stand for long. Now it's picturesque to live by the railroad. It's no big deal if a rail comes by your house. You ever hear that term, wrong side of the track? It's meant because I
Yes.
was in a neighborhood that was less than because it was near the railroad. That's not really the feeling anymore. So the rail business doesn't want all your freight. It's not a good fit for a lot. Please explain what is the right kind of commodities, what's the right kind of stuff to move on rail?
So the railroads break up their business into two primary components. They break it up into intermodal, which is containers that are moving on flat cars. That's 45 to 50% of overall freight moved on rail. And then about 50 to 55% of freight that moves on rail is what they call a carload business, or merchandise and commodities that are moving on rail. On the intermodal side of the business, you have IMCs, or intermodal marketing companies. So that concept was developed because the railroads wanted to partner with these almost wholesalers of their freight rates. So the IMCs almost play that middleman role that we were referring to earlier, to be able to help bridge that gap between the ocean freight carriers, the shippers, the warehouses, the terminals, and the railroads. But on the other side of that business, which is the commodity carload side of the business, that is really more controlled by the railroads, and the pricing you get directly from the railroads. And there really isn't that sort of large element of an intermediary or 3PLs. When you think about freight moving by rail, as I mentioned earlier, it's really a few components or a few primary criteria that needs to be checked before you can justify the move. As I mentioned before, it's really anything long haul. So anything over 500-600 miles, anything within that, trucking is probably going to be more competitive on price. So that number one. Number two, it's going to be volume. So it's 3 to 4 trucks per rail car is the ratio. And even at that, if you're just moving one carload or two carloads, even if you're over that 600 miles, it may not hunt, because there's a lot of other components of rail. You have to lease the rail car if you're not using the system cars by the Class 1 railroads. Class 1 railroads don't own tank cars. So you would have to, if you're moving anything by liquids, you would have to actually lease or own the tank cars. And a lot of shippers that haven't historically moved freight by rail and they wanted to dip their toe in the water are very weary of taking on long-term lease agreements when they don't know whether the move is actually going to work out. So those are the two primary criteria. And the third primary criteria is you have to be okay with not having a very precise delivery time. With truck, you can call a 3PL in one day, and the next day you're moving a load from Chicago to LA. Rail, there needs to be a lot more lead time in order for you to be able to schedule, to book the freight. And then you get a window of time to be able to get that load into a delivery sort of window. And if you're okay with the fact that delivery time is plus or minus, call it a day or two or more, so that's fine. And most commodities, if you think about most inputs that are going into the consumption or production of some type of product, timing is not as important as it is for a dairy product, bread, or any of these products that are perishable. That becomes a lot more sort of time sensitive. But if time sensitivity is not as important to you, but you want to save cost and have a reliable mode, rail is definitely way to go. And plus, it diversifies your exposure. COVID really was a good indicator of how important it was to diversify your transportation portfolio and be able to have a mix of different sort of modes, because we all knew what happened during COVID. The prices spiked in trucking and capacity got super tight. So if you at least had some of your freight moving by rail, you had a way to diversify your exposure and mitigate some of that risk. So we saw a large amount of shippers that never really thought they'd ever move freight by rail, really taking a hard look at it just because they wanted to diversify the risk and effectively create some leverage when they were negotiating freight rates with the trucking carriers.
Yeah. I want to clarify a few things just for my own education. I'm sure I asked the dumb questions. There's other people who probably have the same dumb question. A rail car, is that the same size as a 53-foot trailer, or is it bigger?
It's about similar in size, in capacity. When you think about domestic products and that are moving, you can use that. So when I'm using that sort of 3 to 4 to 1 ratio, I'm thinking 3 to 4 trucks with those container type sizes that are moving by rail.
So I can't move like one truckload. That it would make more sense to do that by truck. But if I had 3 or 4 trucks, then okay. And intermodal container is the same container that comes over on the ocean. And the real advantage is in the olden days, not so long ago, you would have to manually unload, the longshoreman would have to manually unload a ship. And it took days. And now we do it with a crane, taking that container out, and we put that on a drayage vehicle and take it to the rail yard, and it gets loaded again. In the past, you would have been unloading at every stop and breaking stuff, and stuff was gone missing. It was infamous that your ports and your rail, you would lose some stuff along the way. And these shipping containers, it's a really efficient way. And loading and unloading boxcars used to be a really big job. You don't hear about people doing that work anymore. Ask your grandparents; they probably will tell you they did that job. And so that's the intermodal, which, by the way, we would not have the life we have today if it wasn't for those shipping containers, because it really transformed trade. We could not do trade with China and Asia the way we do right now without the shipping container. And it wasn't really around until the late 50s, 60s. And it revolutionized our world. And not just the business, revolutionized our world.
Absolutely.
And so then the other piece is the carload. And that's just the traditional boxcar that you load and unload. And what goes in those cars?
So when you think about the carload or the commodity side of the business, think about it into effectively 3 different buckets. Bucket number 1 is your dry bulk. Bucket number 2 is your liquid bulk. And bucket 3 is your dimensional. So think wind turbines and off-sized products. On the dry bulk side of the business, still the largest commodity by movement is going to be your coal and aggregates. But think about your metal, your lumber. Think about all these different products that are inputs into the development or the production of bigger materials. That's what your dry bulk is. And your liquids are exactly what you would think it is, whether it be a renewable fuels, whether it be a diesel fuel, whether it be a chemical. Your liquids are going to be primarily products that are going to be inputs into some sort of processing or blending of some type of sort of end product. And they typically are going to be broken down into 2 different categories as well, which is going to be hazmat and non-hazmat. And when you look at liquids, we are in Houston. We're probably the largest hub of rail, in particular for oil and gas and for the energy industry. And stone throw away from my house, there's terminals and ports with tanks and processing blending facilities. And if you look at a bird's eye view of Houston, you can just see all the different sort of rail served processing facilities for all the liquids. But those are your sort of 2 primary buckets of product. And then your third sort of smaller bucket is going to be the dimensional loads, but those are going to be more one-off moves. The dry bulk and the liquid bulk is primarily what you're going to see moving on rail for carload business. And that's about 50 to 55% of all moves on rail. And when you think about the rail car assets themselves, there's about 1.6 million rail cars in the US. And 800,000 of those 1.6 million are going to be flat cars for intermodal. And about 800,000 of those are going to be your gondolas, your hoppers, your box cars, your tank cars. So it's pretty evenly split when it comes to the assets that are actually moving the freight by rail.
Yep, and so a lot of other parts, like I'm an automotive guy originally, a lot of those automotive parts will be in those intermodal containers. So it's what's nice about them is you load them up somewhere in Asia, you ship, and the next time it gets opened is in a factory in Indiana. And in the olden days, it would have been loaded and unloaded 10 times, that making it virtually impossible to do business with. And so this has enabled us to do business by reducing that cost. But when we're moving stuff by rail, it's lessening congestion on the roads. Maybe you can give us some stats on that, but also it's cleaner and greener. Please elaborate.
So let me take you back to the origin of Commtrex back in the 2016, 2017 time period. I was on the environmental markets desk at JP Morgan. So I saw the sort of the cap and trade legislation that was going to the government. And I saw in Europe, there were mandatory compliance programs for carbon. Looking forward down the road 10 years, I knew that at some point within the US, you're going to see a much larger movement towards sustainability, number one. And 4 trucks off the road for every 1 rail car, that effectively means that moving freight by rail is about 75% more or less carbon intensive or more carbon friendly than moving freight by truck. So if you are a shipper and you're trying to figure out how to reduce your carbon footprint because you had in the US maybe voluntary goals, or maybe you're a American division of a European company, so you actually have mandatory compliance programs, one of the fastest or low-hanging fruit ways for you to be able to reduce that carbon footprint is to take trucks off the road and to move more freight by rail, right? To lower your emissions.
Yeah. So I got a quick question. So you said takes 4 trucks off the road. Does that mean the goods that fit into 4 trucks would fit into 1 boxcar?
So when you think boxcar, just think just generically. Think of your open hoppers. So when you see an open rail car with frac sand or with any type of dry bulk product, it takes 4 of those sort of trucks that are carrying that type of dry bulk product, or 4 tanker trucks for every 1 hopper or 1 gondola full of that exact same product.
Yeah, so there's some real advantage. And I told you this before we hit the record button, that one time I was driving through Chicago. Many times I've driven through Chicago, and there are so many trucks. But between Chicago and Gary, Indiana, which is like an hour drive, I think, there are so many trucks. You're like, why am I the only one driving a minivan here? And I remember thinking, God, it'd be nice if the trucks had their own road. And then I noticed there's the railroad. And I was like, they do. It's right over there. And I started thinking about it very differently. And I've always had this thought that, and this is nothing against truckers or trucking. It's just weird sometimes when you're driving, especially in the winter, when it feels very hazardous and you're out there with a whole bunch of trucks. They splash up a pretty big pile of snow on you on some days. And you wouldn't know in Houston, but it happens.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you make, because so that was one component, was the sustainability component. And the other component was the next generation, your millennials, Gen Y, Gen Z, the folks who do trucking today. When you ask them what they want their kids to do, you're very rarely going to find them to say that I want my kids to go into long haul trucking.
We have to make that job a lot more attractive if we're going
Yes.
to ever have people be in it. And that means it has to pay well, and it has to get them off the road. And I think we're going to have to start optimizing around truck schedules rather than pickup and delivery schedules. That's my own sense of it. I live by a tractor supply where I see the guys sleep at the parking lot overnight. And sometimes I talk to those guys, and then they're waiting for their hours in the morning to drive home. And sometimes they live in Ohio. And I was like, I'm in Michigan. So these guys had to spend the night to deliver in the morning, and it makes no sense.
That's right. That's right. So moving forward, what you're saying is exactly right. If the industry doesn't figure out a way to make the job more attractive and create more incentives, or at least change the schedules, by default, a lot of that freight's if it's going long haul, is going to have to move by rail.
Yep. So we talked about the stuff that can move by rail. And again, it's got to be high volume. But if you have the high volume stuff and it's going at least 500-600 miles, and that it potentially can move by rail. But now let's talk about this marketplace that you created. You created this marketplace for 3 types of companies. It's the shippers, it's the logistics providers, and it's, of course, the rail the rail served businesses. So let's talk about each one of them and what you are doing. What problem do they have that you are solving? So the first one, let's start with the rail served businesses. What is a rail served business?
So when you think about the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, you have about 200,000 miles of track that's servicing all three countries. Before Commtrex was started, it was very difficult for you to be able to have visibility into what warehouses, terminals, ports, what rail served businesses are operating on these lines and where you can find them. Gary, Indiana, if you needed to move rail freight to a warehouse in Gary, Indiana, how would you find that? You would go to the Class 1 Railroad's website. You would go to Google and type in and look for a short line. But there wasn't a platform that digitally connected that shipper with that carrier.
What is a short line? I mean, I know what it is. I just learned, but please tell us, what is a short line rail line?
So that's a Class 2 or Class 3 railroad. So think Class 1 railroads are the highways, and then the feeders or the side roads are the short line railroads. So the short line railroads are almost your across all the different sort of rail networks. So you have your 6 major Class 1 railroads, and you have about 600 short line railroads that are the connecting railroads to all the different Class 1 railroads across North America, across US, Canada, and Mexico.
So those short line railroads, those are the ones that typically go into an industrial park or a big factory, right?
That's exactly right. If you are moving freight by rail, you're going to look at two things. You're going to look at where do you ultimately want to go, and you're going to look at who's the serving carrier for that sort of destination point that you're trying to get to. And a lot of times that destination point is going to be served by a short line railroad and not by a mainline Class 1 railroad. So it's effectively a handoff. So the freight's going to go on the main line. So whether that be BNSF UP, CNCPKC, or CSX or NS, and then once it goes to the highway, if it wants to get directly to, let's say, Gary, Indiana, you're going to jump on a short line that's going to get you to that final endpoint in Gary, Indiana. Now, if you have a rail served carrier or a rail served customer, it'll take you that freight directly to the rail served customer. But if your customer is not rail served, that short line is going to act as the translator, or there's going to be a translator on that short line that will take that freight, move it onto truck, and that truck will take it last mile to the customer.
Yeah, I'm going to ask some, again, very basic questions. I apologize. So I'm moving something all the way from California. We'll use Gary, Indiana, for the example today. So it's 300 cars on that train, and 2 of them have to go to this short line in Gary, Indiana. How do you pull them out? Do they actually stop the train at that place and then say, okay, pull these 2 out, which are 150 and 151, because they have to go, and then another engine pulls them down that short line?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So every short line railroad has their own switching. They have their own locomotives or industrial switchers. The Class 1 railroad will, the services each of these different short lines a certain amount of, or translators or warehouses a certain amount of days. I think Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Gary, Indiana, the short line there or the translator in Gary, Indiana is served those 3 days a week. So that railroad will come into that sort of handoff point or that switching point to where it will hand that freight off to a short line railroad, and that short line railroad will take it to the transfer facility, to the customer that's on the rail. But effectively, it will be a handoff between the Class 1 railroad and the short line railroad.
So those short line railroads run like a few times a week? How does that work? Because I can't imagine they're always, if you have an industrial park that you're servicing, you have a location there, I can't imagine they're getting a rail car every day.
Oh no, short line railroads are they're pretty much 5-7 day a week operations. It's just a matter of how many days the Class 1 railroad services that short line. So the Class 1 railroad is moving the freight on the highway, and then the short line is taking it off the highway, moving it to that sort of to that.
I'm always intrigued with those short line railroads, because I used to always go, I never understood what those things did, because you drive by them, there's a railroad to nowhere.
Yeah, and they play a very critical role in the supply chain because the short line railroads really are touching the customers constantly. So whether you're a large or a smaller shipper, typically you're talking to a short line railroad because you're talking about getting freight into these rural areas or to these more isolated areas where typically it's going to be a transit facility or a short line railroad that's going to be managing the freight there. So typically you're going to the short line railroad and talking about your move, and the short line railroad is almost acting as an interface between you and the Class 1 railroad.
And so are they transloading at that point, more or less taking it off of the rail car and putting it into a truck for you so it can be delivered locally?
That's exactly right. Short-line railroads do play an extremely critical role because they'll have transloaders on the line or they'll act as the actual transloader themselves. But transloading is a very important part of the supply chain as well, because if you are a shipper and you want to move freight to a customer that does not have a rail spur or served by rail, the way you're going to be able to get that product to that destination is through getting it to a transloader where it's going to be offloaded and taken to that final mile. But transload is the growth area for the Class 1 railroads. If they're going to be able to take trucks off the road and grow the carload volume and grow that network or even grow the intermodal volume, transloaders are going to be the instrumental to that mechanism to be able to move freight from truck to rail.
And so the railroad companies and the rail served businesses, which are the transloaders, the warehouses, the ports and different things, how are you helping them?
Two primary ways we help them. Number one, we bring visibility to the shippers. If you are and there's 600 short line railroads, we have about 450 on our system. We have about 1,700 transload facilities across North America on our system. And just think about all the rail track across North America. And a lot of these short lines or transloaders, their focus is on being able to service their customers, and they're very industrial focused. They're not digital marketers. They
Right.
don't know how to get to the top of Google and be able to create a way to amplify their presence to shippers. And that's what we do for them, right? We provide that pipeline or that conduit of visibility directly to the shipper. So
Yeah.
visibility, number one. And number two, we act as a content platform as well. So we have 101s, we have Ask the Experts, quick reads. We have a newsletter that goes out twice a week to over 10,000 subscribers. We act as a way to be able to educate shippers on all the different aspects of rail. So a lot of these short lines and a lot of the transloaders or warehouses, they can help you at their particular point, but they're not going to find you rail cars. We have the largest rail car marketplace in North America with 75,000 rail cars in our system. They're not going to help you connect the Class 1 railroad. They can, but we try to facilitate the connection between the shipper and the Class 1 railroad. So the other component of our business is really educating the next generation of shippers on moving freight by rail.
It is very interesting because, again, the need for the intermediaries is helping what sometimes are small companies. It could be a small trucking company in the case of freight brokerage. It could be these short line railroads that, again, they're never going to get found on Google. And by the way, one of the reasons they're not going to get found on Google is who's going to Google them. It's funny. I suspect I'm not the only one. I'm going over my head. Where are the short line railroads? And I keep thinking I live close to Ann Arbor, and there's one that goes by, and I don't know what they do. And I'm always like, where's that railroad go? And I was thinking it's going to the middle of nowhere. That's always my first thought. But those are the short lines. So if you know of a rail line, there you go. Is that abandoned? What's going on there? It's a short line.
And you'll be surprised that maybe that short line railroad in Ann Arbor is probably servicing several industrial facilities and warehouses over 150-mile, 200-mile radius. That short line is performing a very critical function for the supply chain because they're the ones that are moving the product from the main line to their short line and getting it to the warehouses, to the transloaders, so that those folks can be able to either get that product to that last mile or be able to manage and store that product and get it to the customers.
How big are short line railroads? How long are they? Are they 2 miles, 10 miles, 100 miles?
Typically on the small side, you'll see 25 to 50 miles, but on average, you'll see closer to 100 to 200 miles. You'll have some really long short lines. Like in Florida, there's a really large short line that extends.
Do they have multiple stops?
Oh, yeah. They have multiple stopping points along the way. So you'll have multiple points that they'll stop along the short line. And they don't use the track just for movement. They also use the track for rail car repair, for rail car cleaning. They use it for rail car storage. They'll have an area just for transloading. So that track is servicing a bunch of different components of the supply chain. It's not just for moving freight back and forth between 2 points. It's really also facilitating all these ancillary services that shippers need.
Got it. So a train that's got a bit like a main rail would be going between Detroit and Chicago, and there might be somewhere where there's a short line in Kalamazoo to support the 50 businesses or 100 businesses that are on that short line.
That's exactly right. They're almost the one of the primary interfaces for the customers of the Class 1 railroads. Is these industrial partners, they're probably one of the main partners for the Class 1 railroads to be able to service and manage all the freight that they move for the customers, because the short line railroads a lot of the times are going to be that origin or destination point for shippers to be able to get their freight onto the main line.
This is quite an education. So getting back to it, for the railroad companies and all the short lines and all of the transloaders and the warehouses that are to serve those railroads, you guys are giving them visibility. You're bringing them business in effect, and you're bringing them business from the shippers. So what are you doing for those shippers?
So again, the shippers spend a lot of time managing their operations, and there's two primary functions that will serve for the shipper. Number one, shippers or the logistics folks within these larger organizations, they're effectively servicing the commercial component, the commercial people for their business, effectively the salespeople. So when the commercial part of their business is trying to sell their product into a new market, a lot of times they're going to go to the logistic folks and say, I have a customer in the Northwest. I know we historically have only sold the Midwest and the Southeast, but go help me figure out how much it's going to cost to be able to move product from Jacksonville, Florida to Tacoma, Washington. And the logistic provider or the fleet manager, the logistician for that company is going to have to figure out what's the cheapest way for me to get product from our facility in Jacksonville to Tacoma, Washington. So how does a shipper do that? The shipper's going to have to figure out, okay, does it make sense to truck or to rail? And if they want to go by rail, they're going to have to figure out all the different legs or the different components of the move. And that's where the visibility component comes in again, is we effectively compress the amount of time it takes for shippers to be able to identify and locate a facility they can work with, number one. And we also compress the amount of time it takes for them to communicate to them. Because believe it or not, a lot of the short lines, terminals, warehouses don't have up-to-date websites. They're not easily found on Google. And what we did is we created a way for them to digitally connect through our system. So we're number one on Google for over 2,000 cities across North America. So if you typed in transloading in pretty much any city in US, Canada, Mexico, we're going to be organic result number one. So we capture about 80% of all Google traffic going to transloaders,
Nice.
to short lines. So that's the primary sort of mechanism we perform. And the secondary mechanism we perform is really informing them about all the different sort of aspects of rail. So we almost service both sides with visibility and with content. And visibility is something that every aggregator has. I don't know. For me, when I travel, I'm going to Google Flights. I'm going to Priceline. I'm not going to United Airlines or to Delta. I'm not going to Marriott or Hilton. I'm going to an aggregator where I can find prices and find locations all in one place. And that's what we serve, is we're the aggregator for the rail industry.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because I've talked to a lot of warehousing people. They call me and they talk about sales. And one of the things I've learned over since COVID, when we had a big e-commerce boom, a lot of companies would say, we used to find our customers because if you typed in our zip code and warehouse, you'd find us. And then we had a whole bunch of VC backed, and not just VC backed, but just the growth in the warehousing space. And all of a sudden, you could type in a zip code in a warehouse, and you're going to get a national company pops up, and the cost of being ranked went sky high. And I've talked to people at railroads in the past when I was still doing logistics. They are not a sales organization like calling a freight broker or something like that. Freight brokers, 3PLs are very often they're sales forward. They've got a big sales staff. They are interested in your business. The railroad companies are almost like reluctant. I don't say this in a mean way. It's just maybe it could work for you, but they were not particularly interested when I talked to them. And so I feel like I'm sure that's changed, but I think it's the nature of their business, I think, because most freight doesn't necessarily fit. So a lot of the people who are calling and saying, hey, I'd like to move this from Grand Rapids to Kalamazoo, and they're like, no, thanks. Right? That's not for us.
No, you're exactly right. The organizational structure for Class 1 railroads in particular are really lend itself to focusing on your larger volume sort of commodity shippers. Think your ADM and Cargills for ags, or your Exxons and Shells and Chevrons for renewable fuels and diesel fuels. That's really where the market managers and salespeople have to focus their time, because that's where a majority of the volume and business is going. That's where the shortline railroads and the transloaders and the warehouses, they help service your lower to middle market type of shippers.
But we don't even know who they are. Honestly, this is why Commtrex exists, because I have no idea. If you said, Joe, drive to a short line railroad, I drive by one. That's all. I don't, but there's probably all over. I'm in the Detroit metro area. I guarantee they're somewhere around here.
No, you're absolutely right. So the market managers and the salespeople, when we started Commtrex, the first partners that we really wanted to get on board were first the short lines, because They're the ones that are touching the customers on the lower to middle size of the market, because the Chevrons and Shells have these massive logistic groups. They have 50, 60, 70, 100 person groups where the real help is needed is at the lower to middle market shippers. And then we had to get the class one railroads. So all the class one railroads are partners with us. And we really do provide a value add to the market manager and salespeople, because they don't have the time to be able to educate shippers on how to lease a rail car, on how to store rail cars, on how to find a translator. So what they do is they say, go to Commtrex. Commtrex will be able to help you find it. And once we're the conduit to that information and to those location providers, now we're helping the overall ecosystem or the industry be able to grow that freight on rail in a much easier way, because it's less friction and it's much easier to find. And overall, if you're a shipper and you want to move freight by rail, you don't know. If you don't have the education, you don't know whether moving 2 truckloads by rail is feasible, or moving 200 miles is feasible until you get the prices. And to find those right people to give you the prices, it does take a lot of time. So being able to compress the amount of time it takes to be able to connect the demand and supply side is really a huge value add for that we provide for the industry.
Yep. And so for the logistics providers, how are you helping them with their business? That'd be the freight brokers, the 3PLs, the transportation companies that are looking to use rail. How do you help them?
So a lot of the freight brokers, very similar to probably a lot of the folks they've ever show, they're highly educated on the intermodal, the container, the truckload side of the business, the LTL side of the business. But when it comes to helping their customers with moving any commodities of any sort, it's really, I don't know how to do this. I've been in trucking my whole life, but I have no idea. My customer wants to move lumber or wants to move metals or wants to move liquids, and they need these inputs for their product. But where do I even start? Who do I even call? Because if they pick the phone up and just call the Class 1 railroad, the Class 1 railroad is going to ask them, do you have a stick code? Do you know exactly what you're moving? Do you have your origin destination? What do you have your rail cars? There's all these questions that are going to be asked, and nobody wants to look like they don't know the answer to these questions. So typically everyone wants to educate themselves. So what we do is we provide that education first and foremost. So a lot of employers are sending their new employees, or they're sending either their back office, middle office folks to our site to go to our one-on-ones to learn about what is it like to be able to move to a rail server warehouse? What's it like to be able to lease a car? What does a leasing contract look like? There's all these different aspects that if you're an intermediary and you're a freight broker and you're servicing your client, and whether your client moves just perishable goods or consumer packaged goods, whatever they're moving probably has some commodity aspect to it, or it potentially has an intermodal aspect to it. So a lot of these intermediaries need to get educated on rail. So they'll use our system for education, number one. And once they're educated on what the different aspects of rail are, they're also going to need to be able to figure out how to connect to the right sources, because that's the value that the intermediaries bring to their customers is, we're providing the knowledge for you. We're doing all the legwork for you. We're going to teach you how to do it. So in order for them to be able to teach their customers, they need to find a source. And that was something that when we started the business, we knew that with all the baby boomers retiring and now the Gen Xers are moving into retirement, all of that information and all of that knowledge and all the intellectual sort of experience that they have had, there was no real time capsule. There was no centralized repository for all that information. So what we started doing 5 years ago is going to the subject matter experts in rail and started asking them very basic questions that shippers would ask and posting it in our site, because you knew once artificial intelligence kicked in, the real sort of edge for folks in AI is going to be 2 things. It's really going to be the proprietary content or the proprietary information you have, number one, and the distribution channels that you have, number 2. And those are the 2 pillars of our business that we've always really focused on is how do we have the best content? So we have 60,000 pages plus of content on the web. And then how do we have the best distribution channels to be able to get shippers to the right place? And so right now we're going from a Commtrex 1.0 to a Commtrex 2.0 because we've taken all the lessons we've learned from 1.0 and are now transitioning to 2.0 to be able to now provide a much more enhanced product for both the shippers and for the supply side of the industry.
Yeah, I love it. And I think one way I look at stuff like the rail, if you look and say, yeah, you can save some money. One way is say, yeah, I can save some money for my existing customers, potentially. It's not a fit for everybody, as we talked about. But another way to look at it is a sales tool, because maybe one of the ways you can win that new business is to say, hey, they're not using rail, and we see there's an opportunity to use rail. So you might save 5% for an existing customer. Great, good for you. But saving 5% for a new customer means you win the business. And so I think that's one way to look at rail, as there's virtually every Fortune 500 company is saying we need to do something to get on the track of more sustainability initiatives. And so bringing something like this, even if it's neutral on the price, is going to be attractive if you can say, hey, this is how much we're saving on our carbon footprint.
And that's where the logisticians within a company really add a tremendous amount of value to the commercial side of their business. Is they're trying to figure out, how do we lower the cost? And in these bids you're talking about, and that's a really good example, because we have so many shippers that come to us, and by default, people that are in commodities, they're dealing with very thin margins because by default, it's a commoditized product. So where do you gain your edge in being able to win that business and provide a lower price? It's going to be on the edges. And where are the edges? It's in the supply chain. It's in that sort of middle mile. And that's where we can provide an edge, number one. And number two, COVID really taught a lot of the shippers a really valuable lesson, which is we need to diversify our exposure to
Yes,
transportation.
yes.
We can't be held over the barrel for 100% of our trucking rates. We need to at least have some mechanism to be able to shift freight from our trucking mode of transportation to rail, just so we can have some flexibility in how we move our product to different markets.
I love it. I love it. So I'm talking to my friend Martin, and we're talking about Beyond the Tracks, the next frontier of American rail. Martin, I'm going to do the best I can on summarize, and then I want to get your final thoughts on the topic. Rail is a great option for certain freight. It's not for everything. It's not the perfect fit for everything, but the stuff that it does well, it does really well. So if it's going to move either intermodal, a lot of that going on, obviously, but there's a lot that's going by carload. What you need is it has to be at least 500-600 miles. It has to be high volume. It's not going to work if it's not high volume. And we need, I think one of the things I learned from talking to you is we need some connector. We need a marketplace, and that's where Commtrex comes in. And it's the place that connects the shippers, the logistics providers, and all the railroad companies and all the rail serve providers, and gets it. And again, I don't say it to be funny. It's match.com for rail, because we need that connector. And I think of the whole rail business is an important part, but I think they are not an outward looking organizations. They are not sales forward. They have their traditional customers who I suspect they serve very well, but they aren't necessarily looking to connect with the rest of us outside of their traditional group. And I think this is where the opportunity is. If you're a logistics provider or a shipper, you say, hey, look, if there's some money to be saved, if there's some opportunities to win new business, get in there. So enough of my blather. Put a big old bow on this, Martin. Final thoughts.
Yeah, and just to further elaborate on what you just said, the Class 1 railroads are trying to move more to a truck-like product. So they're putting more IoT sensors so that you can track in real time where the cars are at.
Oh, I like it.
The Class 1 railroads do realize that they need to improve certain aspects of their business, and short line railroads are servicing that as well. But to put a bow on it, rail is and always has been a very important and critical part of the American economy, of the North American economy. And as you see more nearshoring happen, as you see more of manufacturing processing moving to Mexico, moving to Canada, you're going to see a lot more rail moving products within the US, Canada, and Mexico, right? Those three countries are really becoming closer and tighter together. And also sustainability is becoming a much more important factor for companies as well. If you believe that sustainability is important, if you believe that it's important to be able to diversify your transportation portfolio, if you believe that it's important to be able to find a lower cost way to move product beyond 500 miles, rail is absolutely the solution you should be looking at. And if you need any help trying to figure out who to talk to, how to do it, how to connect with providers in your area, there's no other platform. We're the only platform that exists to be able to provide that sort of connection. And that's why we have the Class 1s, the short lines, the transloaders, the warehouses, the providers partner with us, because we are that sort of mechanism to help them grow their volume and help them grow their business.
I love it. I love it. Martin, what I'll do is I'll put a link to your LinkedIn profile, a link to your website, and any of the links you and your marketing team give me, I'll put those in the show notes so people can click through and talk to you. I love what you're doing. It's so important. And again, I said in the beginning, and I'll say it again, I don't talk enough about rail on my podcast. It's just not, doesn't seem to be as much for such an important mode, we don't talk enough about it. Just feels like it's not front and center. When we talk about transportation that's domestic, it's usually truckload, LTL, and very little else.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Hopefully the shippers that are watching the show or any of the freight brokers on it they didn't hear about Commtrex. Hopefully they learned about Commtrex. And our real goal is to really help create a more sustainable sort of freight network. And that the more we can collaboratively work together to be able to move more freight by rail, the greener and I think the more sustainable our environment and our economy will be.
I love it. I love it, Martin. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joe. Appreciate you having me on.
And thank all of you for listening to my podcast. Your support is very much appreciated. Until next time, onward and upward. You have been listening to the Logistics of Logistics podcast, where we engage with leaders in the logistics and supply chain community. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave us a nice review on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you listen. Also, please check out our videos on YouTube and connect with us on LinkedIn. We're very big on LinkedIn. And you can also reach us on the logisticsoflogistics.com, our website.